YouTube. Today we're going to work on the CRX again, but first I had to definitely clean up my shop a little bit. I don't know if you noticed in like the last video or whatever, but there's shit everywhere. And I get like that sometimes when I got a big project or something going on and I'm just thrashing away and then I run into 100 problems. The last thing I want to do is clean. So I just kind of have my brain set on getting the car running, and then after the car is running, then I clean. So yeah, now I clean the garage up, and we can do some finishing touches on the CRX to get it running good. Alright, so in the last video I was definitely struggling a shitload on this thing, and turned out to be a couple wires on the jumper harness that were like broken or either misplaced on the harness. So I got that all sorted out. Now the car is running great. I also had an issue last night. I was actually up till like 5 in the morning working on this thing because I took it out for like the initial test drive, and I drove it and I cracked on it a few times, and I'm like, man, this thing is just a slouch. It's not making any horsepower. And you know, and then on my way back home, I only drove it for like 2 miles because I'm like, okay, something's not right. Drove it home, and by the time I pulled it back in the garage, I noticed the thing was just clanging. Like the motor was noisy, and it sounded like it was knocking. So I'm like, oh shit, you know, what the hell went wrong here? So I started it up and looked at it. I also noticed that like it was idling really high, and like it just had no power. It cranked like shit. I'm like, man, this thing just sounds like it's on its way out here. So I pulled the valve cover off to check the valve lash, and all the nuts that hold the I don't even know what you call it, like the set screw that you set the valve lash with. There's a lock nut that goes on the top of it to set it, and there's 16 of those nuts that are supposed to be in the cylinder head. There was only 4. All the other ones backed completely out, so the valve lash was just ginormous. So obviously the engine ran like complete garbage. So I found like 4 of them laying in the cylinder head, and then I'm like, shit, there's the only way that they either went into the motor, which would be completely terrible, and they would have damaged the pistons or something, or the cylinder head, whatever, and or they would have went into the oil pan. So I found out, I pulled the oil pan off, and there was the rest of the nuts were laying in the oil pan. Thank God they didn't get damaged in the cylinder head or whatever. So I thrashed that all back together, lash the valves and everything like that, and this thing's smooth as a whistle now. So I'm hoping I got lucky and this thing will be okay now. But that's what I get for trusting somebody else to put my cylinder head together and tell me that everything was good to go. The car has a couple coolant leaks. There's one on the back of the motor somewhere. I don't know if it's coming from a heater hose or something like that, but it's leaking like behind the motor, like almost like under the passenger seat. So I'm hoping it's not like heater core or something leaking. But yeah, we got a leak back there, and then we got a leak up on the upper radiator hose here. This like spring clamp must be kind of weak, so I'm just going to replace it with an actual hose clamp, and that should fix that leak. I also had to modify my or not shift, but the clutch cable bracket here. As you can see, I had to weld it and move the bracket down a little bit because this cable was too short to fit. When I installed it, you know, just without modifying it or anything like that, the clutch wouldn't disengage fully, and the clutch was actually slipping. So now I lowered the bracket a little bit and re-welded it back on, and now the clutch is great. I also made a throttle cable bracket with just the ones that I had laying around. Just kind of bolted, you know, this to this, and then, you know, just made something work. The throttle opens all the way and closes all the way just like it should. So hopefully that doesn't give me any issues. Also had to get the map sensor running here. I also got the bumper back on the car, and the fenders and the hood, obviously. It's kind of looking like a car again. I still don't have my corner lights put on just because the corner lights that I have are kind of pieces of shit and they don't really fit. So I'm just rocking it with no corner lights for now. And then this fender is obviously completely fucked. It's like down here you can see it's all bashed in, and all the bolts right here that like hold it on are all broken off into the frame. Like I said, this car is definitely a pile of shit. That's why we painted the engine bay brown, and why we're just, you know, trying to just polish a turd here and make fun out of nothing. This is like every 16-year-old's dream car. You know, rice burner and whatever, and 9 times out of 10, the 16-year-old that has this car looks identical to this, and it is extremely slow with the 1.5 liter non-VTEC and all that shit. So yeah, I'm hoping we can surprise a lot of people with this car when we pull up next to them at a stoplight. So I am trying to find the coolant leak on this thing because, like I said, it seems like it's coming from the back of the block, or the, you know, behind the motor somewhere over here. And I replaced the hose clamp up here that was leaking, and I have the radiator cap off currently, but I took off one of these heater hoses because I think like it wasn't sealing very good where I clamped it. So I think I'm just gonna reclamp where I did this heater hose here, and hopefully it'll work. I'm actually gonna do something kind of funny, but it works really good for finding leaks with pretty much anything. I use it on exhaust all the time, and this is the first time I'm trying it on a cooling system, but there's not really much water in this thing right now. But I'm going to blow into either the radiator cap or the heater hose. I think it'll be easier on the heater hose here. And I'm going to take my e-cig and vape into the heater hose and see if we can see anything leaking. You can do this with like vacuum lines and stuff too if you're trying to find like a vacuum leak or whatever. They make machines for it, but or they make like smoke machines for finding vacuum leaks and stuff like that. But I mean, I am a smoke machine. I don't see any vape coming out. Like I said, I think the hose that I'm blowing into was the one that was actually leaking. So I think I'm just gonna replace the clamp and stuff that was on this hose, and we will see if it leaks then. I think I got all the coolant leaks sorted out, and yeah, just letting it warm up and leave the heat on and just get the coolant cycling through the motor, and hopefully no more leaks. This fender is rattly as shit because there's no bolts holding it in right now. I just kind of have it placed on there. But the motor is pretty smooth. Alright, I think we got all the coolant leaks figured out on the car, and I got it fully warmed up. It's been running for like 10 minutes now. So I figured I'd give you guys a little rev and show you how it sounds. It is like super cold and windy, or not cold, but it's like, it is like super cold and rainy outside, so there's a lot of like, you know, smoke in the air, like as you can see. And you know, obviously the car is smoking a little bit because of that. So. When the smoke cleared, in the world's biggest deer. And there he was, gone. From Illinois.
Did you see the 30-pointer?
Did you see the 30-pointer? I don't know where everybody's from, but here in Wisconsin, this weekend is opening season for gun deer, so white-tailed deer, and it is a like huge following here. A lot of people deer hunt. I used to, but I don't know, I got into cars and stuff, and you know, my passion is here more than it is deer hunting. But yeah, and you ever heard the song "The 30-Point Buck"? That's a funny one. Let's get back to work. All right, so I took this dash cluster bezel thing off so I can get at the speedo cable, because the speedo cable is actually you need to install it into the trans first and then into the cluster, and to do that I got to take it out of the cluster. So I got to take the speedo cable out, and then I'm probably going to mount my wideband. On this you know, bezel thing, on the side or something. I need to do this because VTEC actually won't work unless your speedometer is working. There's ways to bypass it and stuff like that, but I'd rather have a working speedometer and have everything working. And then I got to install the wideband, obviously, because I'm going to tune this thing. I don't really drive cars untuned, at least for very long. Alright, so I just jacked the car up and I threw the O2 sensor for my wideband into the exhaust. I had an O2 actually set up in the exhaust right after the header. So got that in, and now I'm going to run the wiring into the car so we can get the rest of the wideband installed. Alright, I got the dash bezel thing back on here for the gauge cluster. I got the cluster back in with the speedo cable attached. A trick for the speedo cable, they're actually really tight fit. You actually have to install the cluster and then push the speedo cable into the cluster once it's fully installed. I actually took a pliers on the back of the speedo cable, and I just kind of used the pliers as leverage to push the speedo cable into the cluster, because like I said, it's a super tight fit. But that's all installed now. I got a little gauge holder here. I don't know if I'm going to keep it or not, but it looks pretty decent for now, you know, for my wideband. And down here we got some wiring going on. I have to take power, and I ran it into a fuse that has switched 12 volts. You don't want to use it constant because then the wideband will never shut off. You got to find something that only has 12 volts when the key is on, and then off when the key's off. So yeah, and then I just got there's a bolt on the side over here that's grounding the wideband, and now I'm just going to have to tie up all these wires, and this thing should be ready to go. And now the wiring is all tidied up, and we should be good to go. I'm going to start this thing up and kind of let it warm up and see what the air fuels are like already with the bass tune that I threw on it. Alright, just fired it up, and we're going to check the wideband now. And it's a little sputtery, so yeah, I think the reason it's sputtery and kind of bouncing around at idle is because it's so lean it's not even registering on the gauge. So we're going to richen up the tune a little bit. Alright, so I'm just going to whip the laptop open here. And this is the tune that's on it. I'm just going to take pretty much the whole thing, and I'm going to add like 15-20%. We'll start with 15. And I'm going to add it to the low cam and the high cam sections. Because if your low cam is lean, your high cam table is going to be lean as well. And you can see that these injectors are pretty well maxed out. We're going to see if the thing holds fuel or not, but yeah, the way that the table looks, it's getting really red after like 6,500. So hopefully we won't run out of injector right away. Go for round 2. The idle seems like it's idling higher and smoother, but it is coming down now. Usually when you first start it up, it's gonna idle a little bit higher and then work its way down. But as you can see, the wideband is reading pretty much exactly where it should. So last night I took this car out for a little drive, and I made it about, I don't know, 1/8 a mile from my house, and the car just went tunk and locked up. The motor did lock up, but the car just shut off, and I like felt it in the suspension, and I don't know. So I got it home now, and I tore into it again today. Tore the bottom end back apart, honestly, just to check everything, and the rods and the mains and everything look good. And when I take the ratchet on the end of the crank pulley, the motor spins super smooth. It spins smooth as butter. Now, when I unhook the plug wires, or I should say when everything is hooked up normally, it cranks like shit. It literally, like, it fights itself as it's cranking, and then I take the plug wires off, and it turns over completely fine, and it's smooth. So I think I've narrowed the problem down to, you know, like one of the sensors in the distributor again. I don't know if my wiring got loose or something. I don't know. I'm going to have to go through the wiring again and verify that all that is good, because I think what's happening is the motor is getting too much ignition timing, and when the motor gets too much ignition timing, it cranks very hard because it's almost igniting before the piston can get all the way to the top. So yeah, it's almost like it's pre-igniting on startup and cannot actually start. So like I said, I've actually had this problem on a few cars. I actually worked on a Tahoe one time at my old job, and the crank sensor was bad because it wasn't spaced off of the crank proper amount. And when the crank sensor like goes out or isn't reading right, it actually throws like 50 degrees extra ignition into the distributor, which in turn makes the engine crank extremely hard. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. It makes perfect sense to me, but so I figured I'd try to explain it a little better. When the ignition timing is too advanced on startup, the piston, okay, so when the piston is in the bore and goes all the way to the top of the cylinder, so top dead center, all that fuel and air mixture is going to be above the piston and in the combustion chamber. And then the spark plug should go off, which in turn explodes the fuel and air mixture, pushing the piston downward. If that spark happens before the piston reaches top dead center, which it normally does, you know, at higher RPM and stuff like that, but on startup, when the motor is spinning very slow, you need to have an ignition timing that is pretty retarded and almost close to 0 degrees, you know, before top dead center. But that fuel and air mixture will explode before the piston reaches the top of the cylinder, and when the spark plug goes off, the motor is now fighting its way through that explosion, you know, to turn over the motor. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. I just figured I'd try to explain it a little bit. I'm not very good at explaining stuff, but I feel like I'm getting a little bit better. So yeah, I'm going to end this video here and get back to working on this thing, and you guys have to check back in another day or so for another video. But hopefully you enjoyed the progress so far on the CRX beater project. And thanks for watching, guys. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you guys are new. If you already are subscribed, thank you, and I will be trying to put out as much content as I can for you guys. So till next time, we'll see you later.